Woman buys food for homeless man, sees him in uniform next day. Homelessness is a stark reality for many people in our communities, but all too often we are too wrapped up in our own lives to help. You never know the impact a small act of generosity can have. When single mom Annie Wen was shopping at the grocery store, she noticed a homeless guy ahead of her in the line struggling to pay. Immediately, she offered to step in. When she spotted him the next day, she realized he'd kept a huge part of his life a secret from her. Little did she know this revelation would lead them both on an extraordinary journey of transformation. 37-year-old Annie Wen lived in Denver, Colorado, and worked as a kindergarten assistant. She had wanted to be a social worker, but life had got in the way. She'd never been able to go to college. The most important person in Annie's life was her 16-year-old son, Henry. He had some learning difficulties, so he was more dependent on her than a regular teen. She had no idea that something was about to happen that would turn both their lives around. Henry's father left when he was 4, so Annie had raised him by herself. She'd done her best to provide her son with everything he needed, but she'd always struggled to make ends meet. Her job didn't pay well and she could only work part-time, needing to care for Henry the rest of the time. Now that he was growing up, she could barely afford to feed them both and often went without dinner so Henry could eat. Annie always put others before herself and was generous even when she had nothing to give. Her friends and neighbors all knew how kind she was and that they could rely on her if ever they were in need. This was because Annie knew just what it was like to be in dire need. She and Henry had experienced some very low times, so she always tried to make sure to help people in any way she could. But she never thought that her generosity would lead her to an encounter that would turn her world upside down. Early one Saturday morning, Annie was doing her grocery shopping. She always went to the grocery store with the lowest prices, and she cut coupons and made use of the best deals to make her limited funds go further. Today, she was stocking up on essentials, making sure she had all of Henry's favorite foods and doing calculations in her head to check she would be able to afford the groceries. Finally, she had finished slowly and carefully choosing what she needed and was waiting in line to pay with Henry by her side. He was playing a game on his phone and not paying much attention. Annie ruffled his hair and waited patiently, thinking about their plans. They were planning to walk in the park later and watch a movie. She loved their special weekends together. Suddenly, something drew her out of her thoughts. The man in front of Annie in the line had a long tangled beard and a tan, prematurely lined face. He was dressed in mismatched clothes that hung off his gaunt frame and his shoes were full of holes. He was clearly homeless. Annie watched him as he rifled through his pockets, trying to scrape up enough change to pay for his meager groceries. The store clerk was glaring at him for holding the line up and was clearly stressed. Seeing the look on his face, Annie decided to step in. "Excuse me, sir," she said in a friendly voice. "Are you hungry?" He looked at her in confusion. "More than you can imagine," he replied sadly. "Thought so, but I couldn't help you mislaid your change. Happens to me all the time. Let me get this one for you. Don't worry about paying me back," she continued. The store clerk looked at Annie suspiciously, but she was firm, handing over the cash to pay for the man's shopping. He smiled gratefully at her and gathered up his grocery bags. During the exchange, Henry looked up from his game and watched his mom hand over the money. He knew they had nothing to spare, so it worried him to see her paying for someone else's food. Would she have to go hungry tonight again? Henry stared at the homeless man with his matted hair and dirty fingernails curiously. He wondered exactly what had happened to him. Wouldn't be long until they found out. The homeless man waited outside until Annie had paid for her own groceries and then stopped her as she left the store. "Thank you, ma'am. God bless you. I just wanted to thank you so much for your act of kindness. I'd love to repay you someday. As you can see, I'm a little down on my luck at the moment, but someday," he said. The homeless man's name was Jake Miller. He lived on the streets close to the grocery store. Annie stopped and had a chat with him, brushing off his gratitude. She started asking him questions. Annie felt an instant connection with Jake. He spoke in a quiet and gentle voice, and she could see that he had pain in his eyes. She asked him about his life, and he wasn't too forthcoming, obviously hiding a truth that was too painful for him to talk about. He simply told her that he'd fallen on hard times and a little about his life on the streets. She listened intently and offered words of comfort while Henry waited patiently beside her. After 20 minutes or so, Annie and Jake finished their conversation and parted ways. Annie had enjoyed chatting to him and hoped that better days were around the corner. She had once been close to being homeless herself, and she knew how easy it was for your life to crumble around you, so she had a lot of compassion for his situation. As for Jake, Annie had touched his heart with her kindness, but neither of them expected to ever see each other again. Little did they know that they were about to meet again under very different circumstances. The next day, Annie accompanied Henry on his paper round. He'd recently got the job, and Annie was thrilled that he was getting some experience in the world of work. She hadn't thought much about her encounter with Jake, apart from worriedly going over her finances so she could account for the extra money she spent on his groceries. But then out of nowhere, Henry spotted something that made Annie do a double take. They reached the newsstand to collect the stack of neatly folded newspapers when Henry pointed a finger right in the middle of the front page of the local paper. "Look, Mom, it's Jake," he said confidently. "What's that, honey?" "Mom, it's Jake from the grocery store in the paper and he's dressed as a soldier," said Henry insistently. Annie blinked and looked at where he was pointing. The man in the photo on the front page of the newspaper was dressed in a spotless military uniform, standing tall and decorated with medals. He was clean-shaven with closely cropped hair. In many ways, he looked nothing like the wild-haired homeless man they'd met at the grocery store, but his face and eyes were the same. Annie wondered briefly if he had a twin in the military. She really didn't know anything about him, but there was something about the photo that told her it was Jake. She looked closer at the article and started to read. Sure enough, the article was about Corporal Jake Miller, a highly decorated soldier who'd fought in Iraq and Afghanistan. He was in the local paper because it was the anniversary of one of his operations and he was going to be honored in a ceremony later that week. However, it didn't mention anything about his homelessness or current situation. Annie couldn't believe it. It was hard to put the two men together, and yet she was sure it was the same man. How could the newspaper be celebrating him and not know he was living on the streets? Just didn't add up. She knew there were a lot of homeless vets, but surely Jake would have mentioned it if she was asking him about his life. She couldn't understand why he would have felt the need to hide his past. Then a thought started to creep into the back of Annie's mind. She had heard of regular people trying to pull off scams by dressing as homeless people and seeing how much they could get out of unsuspecting strangers. Annie had felt such a connection with Jake, but now she wondered whether he had been lying to her all along. Maybe it had all been a big joke. He wasn't really homeless and he'd been just trying to scam her out of a few bucks that she didn't have to spare. Annie was confused. She thought she was doing a good deed, but now she was questioning everything. Being alone in the world apart from Henry, she found it hard to trust her gut. Had she been wrong about Jake? She tried to put the encounter out of her mind, but she couldn't forget it. If Jake was in fact homeless, what were they doing throwing some ceremony for him to thank him for his service and not helping put a roof over his head? A few days later, the day of the ceremony, Annie was back at the grocery store stocking up on her usual items. Henry was at school, so she was by herself. She walked up and down the aisles, searching for the best deals as usual, when she realized that she felt like she was being watched. She turned to look behind her, but there was no one there. She continued shopping, glancing over her shoulder every now and then. She hoped no one else was going to play a trick at her. But then suddenly she turned a corner and the soldier who looked like Jake appeared as if out of nowhere. He had a big smile on his face. "Annie," he said happily, "I hope I'd find you here. Do you recognize me?" It was Jake in uniform. "I have something important that I have to do today, but I wanted to find you first to talk to you. You thought the other day that you were just paying for some groceries, but it was so much more than that. Let me tell you my story," he continued. Annie greeted him in surprise and then waited, interesting to hear what he would say next. Would it tally up with the newspaper article? It did. Jake explained that it was true. He'd been a decorated soldier and fought in Iraq and Afghanistan, but once he'd come home, his life had fallen apart. He'd struggled with PTSD and he felt like he couldn't connect with his family. They couldn't understand what he'd been through. Slowly but surely, he'd lost everyone and everything that he had and ended up on the streets. For all he had lost in dedicating his life to serving the country, Jake felt ashamed and forgotten. He'd fallen into a deep depression and had been unable to access services for struggling veterans. He felt as though people looked at him sitting there on the sidewalk like he was worthless, and that made him feel worthless. But a little spark of hope had ignited inside him when Annie paid for his groceries. Not only had Annie given him respect and dignity when she'd politely offered to buy his shopping, but she'd also spoken to him like a human and taken time out of her day to chat with him. Her kindness had had a transformative effect, making him remember the good in humanity rather than just focusing on the bad. It was after Jake's encounter with Annie that he decided he would attend the military ceremony after all. Jake had visited an old buddy from the army who had looked after his uniform for the last few years. Putting it on had brought up so many emotions, but he was determined now that he would turn his life around. He'd gone to the grocery store to find Annie, and they headed to the ceremony together. Jake used the ceremony to make a speech about the realities of life after returning from war and the struggles that so many vets like him faced. He received a standing ovation. Jake's speech at the ceremony had a profound impact on the community. People were moved by his story and the challenges veterans face. The local news covered the event, and soon, offers of help and support began pouring in. Veterans who'd been struggling in silence found the courage to seek assistance, and the community rallied around them. Jake was overwhelmed by the response. He couldn't believe so many people felt just like him, and he was grateful to Annie for helping him to speak out. Inspired by the positive response, Jake and Annie decided to join forces. They both realized that they had a unique opportunity to make a real difference in the lives of veterans who'd fallen on hard times. With their combined efforts, they could provide not only immediate help but also a framework for long-term support for veterans in need. Annie had always been dedicated to helping people, and now she had a chance to channel that motivation into her work. Together, Jake and Annie started a charity for veterans. Their organization provided veterans with access to mental health services, job placement assistance, and housing support. They worked tirelessly to ensure that no veteran would feel forgotten or left behind. Henry helped them out on the weekends, delivering leaflets all over the neighborhood to spread the word. With the donations rolling in, Annie was even able to pay herself a little more than she'd earned at the kindergarten, meaning more security for her and Henry. The charity quickly gained recognition for its impactful work. They organized fundraisers, awareness campaigns, and community events to support veterans and their families. Jake and Annie's dedication inspired others to get involved, and the charity grew rapidly. Jake was over the moon to be able to channel his experience into something positive. He'd promised to pay Annie back for the groceries, and now he really could. After they reached their first fundraising target, he took her and Henry to dinner to celebrate. When Jake and Annie met at that grocery store, they had no idea that both of their lives were about to change forever. What started as a simple act of generosity blossomed into a powerful force for good, changing the lives of countless veterans and their families. Jake and Annie are proof that sometimes all it takes to make a difference is a chance encounter, a caring heart, and the willingness to take that first step. We hope that the charity is flourishing and that they are both finding fulfillment and joy in their work, helping the people who need it most.